Fabulous, thank you. So first of all then, just to welcome everybody to this webinar today. Thank you for being here. Just a little bit of housekeeping just in terms of cameras being sort of turned off and microphones on mute. Obviously, unless you're presenting or asking a question, that would be fab. It just helps to keep things moving and helps with the connectivity, which would be great. We do welcome you to share your experiences and interact with the sort of when requested. But if you can just be mindful not to kind of mention specific students or any sort of confidential information, so that we're able to use the learning to share on our website for sort of other practice educators and people across the partnership, that would be fabulous. So thank you. So again, welcome today. We have a few speakers for you today, speaking on the subject of induction and the critical first 2 weeks of placement with a learning curriculum approach. So academics and social workers from across the West Midlands Teaching Partnership have collaborated to co-deliver this webinar for social work practice educators. My name's Deborah Stewart. I'm one of the consultant social workers for the West Midlands Teaching Partnership. And this webinar will provide practice expertise, knowledge and guidance, and perspectives from current students as well, to help practice educators deliver quality practice learning opportunities and assessment during the induction period. There will be a mix of, most of the presentations are live today actually, and then we have a pre-recorded one at the end as well. And so you'll be asked as we go along for your answers to questions and to contribute your experiences as well. Just moving us along. So it's myself and Diane Asamoah who were just presenting the introduction to you, who she is. Do you want to just introduce yourself, Diane?
Yeah, welcome everyone. My name's Diane Asamoah. I'm one of the senior lecturers at Worcester University. So happy Christmas, a bit early, but still.
Lovely. Thanks, Diane. So yes, just moving us on then. So our objectives then today from this webinar is to support practice educators and work-based supervisors to refresh knowledge and understanding of adult learning theory, designing creative and innovative approaches to learning curriculums, to develop competence and confidence, excuse me, in developing learning curriculums for students in those critical first 2 weeks, and exploration of what works or hasn't worked so well with online and in-person induction, and focusing on what students have found useful, and to build skills and knowledge for evaluating and assessing the learning from induction.
So we've got a few guest speakers with us. We're from all over the West Midlands, and lots of people who are practice educator leads and people who work in learning and development from local authorities mainly. So the first speakers after us will be talking about how to get to know your student. So that'll be Helen Stanley and Helen Franklin. And then following that, we'll be having a discussion about how you prepare your team to support a student, and that's with Claire and Zoe. And the last bit, that'll be the recorded part, but Amanda will be here for answering some questions. It's like, how can you evidence what happens in an induction to help form your assessment of the student?
Lovely.
So we first thought about what is a learning curriculum. So we had a little look, Debs and I, and Leslie Parish as well, about, she helped us develop these slides as well, about what a learning curriculum is and the definition. So we got a few here. So the first one is about a written document that includes goals, plans and objectives, and it includes the content and learning activities and evaluation procedures that will happen whilst you have a student. The second one is a plan that consists of learning opportunities, and this one looks at about timescales in that plan. So timescales and a tool to aim to bring about behavioural changes in the student with with planned activities. And the last one is talking about what a good placement is like and good planning. In the induction, it'll be about making the student feel as welcome as possible and to have like some familiarity with their roles and their responsibility within the organisation and understand where they sit within the organisation as a whole. So the next bit we wanted you to have a think about was how confident you are in developing a learning curriculum for the students that you support. And we just wanted people to put in the chat what they'd score themselves, with 1 being the lowest and 10 being the highest. So how would you rate yourself? Put your thoughts in the chat. So Stephen's scoring him a 5, so about halfway. Got a lot of 7s. So Chris is a 3, Carol 6. How many people have we got in the session, Deb?
So there's sort of 48, including presenters.
Okay. We've got no 10s yet, so Laura's on a high with an 8, so that's really positive.
Yeah, quite a few 3 or 4s, and it can be harder to kind of conceptualize at the beginning of your sort of PE training as well.
Yeah, so hopefully if you keep those scores in mind and then reflect at the end how you feel about delivering a learning curriculum that's student-centred is really important, and see if we can get those 5s to 6s and 8 to like a 9 or 10. So that'd be really good. My screen's paused, so I'm not sure if you can hear me or see me still.
Yes, we can still hear and see you.
Okay, brilliant. Should we go on to the next slide?
Yeah. So this was feedback from current students from the University of Worcester, weren't they, Diane? And obviously we wanted to make sure that we had a sort of foundation of student feedback to kind of base some of our presentations on today, so that we're really listening to what students have found useful and what they've found works for them. So there's just some quotes here from them. So the first one is shadowing in the induction period was extremely helpful, as it gave me a chance to watch social workers undertaking certain tasks and then give me some protected time.
Yeah, we've got a booking on Friday, and I was just wondering if we can drop the bags off.
Okay, to be able to ask about processes they had used and how they would need to follow those up. I also found that this was more interesting and easier to learn by actually being there rather than reading about the processes. So there's something there about sort of experiential learning as well, isn't there?
Another student wrote, the induction was well planned, and this has given me a good insight into the functions of children's services. I felt really confident after the induction period to commence frontline work. Then I started doing shadowing shifts with an experienced social worker, and this has given me a good exposure to the challenges of frontline work.
Thanks. And another student commented on the fact that being given reams of policies and procedures to read on top of the modules as well was unnecessary and not necessarily helpful to their learning as well. And so if any of you as well have ideas on what's and experiences of what's worked well for you during induction and that you've experienced with students as well, then please put that in the chat as well to share with other practice educators and work-based supervisors that are here. It'd be good to hear your experiences as well. So yeah, just to build on that, and Diana's has summed up for us some of the things coming out of the feedback from students and what's worked well from their perspective. So shadowing them has been the first one that's come out from that. Learning theoretical approaches to practice during induction has been seen as useful. Having a focus on the students' strengths and making sure that they're identified and worked upon during induction as well. Practice educators using a coaching approach with students as well, and students having the ability to manage their own times and sort of to work autonomously and look at managing their own sort of workload as well.
Students also said that sometimes at the beginning of their placement, they're just given a load of policies and procedures to work through. And obviously, a lot of those are really important, but we need to help them understand why they're important and help them to link that with the practice that they're doing. Students said that having all the setup of computers and ID badges, all of those things before they started was really helpful and thoughtful. They also said that by the end of their induction, the best case scenario would be that they felt confident to start stepping out and knowing what they're doing a little bit. So confidence building is essential. And then also incorporating different elements of formal training that your organisation might have. So encompassing that into the induction, and overall just feeling welcomed by the whole team was really important.
Thanks. So, sorry, go on, Diane.
And you go.
Sorry, I was just going to say we had some sort of feedback, didn't we, from that came out of the quality assurance for practice learning feedback from students, saying that at times they, because of the online sort of learning situation and working situation, there are times when they felt that they were pestering sort of practice educators and sort of other team members when they needed to approach them for support. So we just wanted to sort of pose a couple of questions just around that and maybe get a little bit of a discussion going in regards to that.
Yeah, so we've got the first question for you, and you can write your answers in the chat, or if you want to put your hand up and turn your microphone on, that's welcome. So how do we support students in that first stage with shadowing activities, but when they're virtual?
Or has anyone got any experience they can share perhaps about how we can support students to feel that they can approach people, you know, when we're working sort of virtually and from home, that they can approach people when they need support, especially during that induction period? Okay, so Daniela said sort of invite to Teams meetings. Yeah, so making sure they're invited in. And yeah, Katie's asking, do we mean when the opportunity itself is virtual? It's just gone off my screen there, or to meet colleagues virtually. Well, yeah, both potentially, Katie. Georgina has said attending strategy meeting reviews and other meetings. So I'm guessing a lot of kind of shadowing and attending meetings to make sure that their student feels embedded in the team. Adding to team chats. And Helen's saying that we need to ensure that they are familiar with other team members, so having one-to-one meetings with other team members, which Zoe and Claire will probably be looking at a bit later when we're talking about preparing the team as well. So Wendy's saying that she's office-based and the student has been allowed to come into the office as well, which has obviously been helpful. She's been able to seek support from other social workers there. And Laura's talking about the welcome of the student being so important and embedding that team around the student approach. Yeah, we've got more people saying about having Zoom chats, using the online forums, and having pre-arranged check-ins as well. Donna's saying there. virtual meetings. Are there any jumping out at you, Diane, that you want to mention?
I think Shazia put about buddying up with team colleagues. Just I think we said before, it's students might not know who's good at certain jobs or who's specialist in certain areas, and having students know who to ask about who's good at IT or who's good at like working with a specific group of people. I think that's really important. But that's a good mix.
Excellent. Thank you. And that is important, isn't it? It's the student knowing exactly who they can go to, and we also have partners from our partnership mentioning that there is a webinar regarding team around the student, and Zoe will be mentioning that later and linking into that too. So thank you. Okay, so I think then that would take us into our next presentation, which is Helen Stanley and Helen Franklin, who are going to come and talk to us about getting to know the students. So I'll just stop sharing mine. Second. There we go.
Okay, do you want me to share the screen, Deborah?
Yes, please. Yeah, I've stopped sharing mine now. Thanks, Helen.
Okay, hopefully this is the right screen. Yeah. Okay, I will apologise in advance if I freeze with my camera on, and I'll probably turn my camera off if I do. My Teams has been playing up all week. So, to introduce myself, I'm Helen Franklin from Keele University, and I'm going to be presenting this with, and I'll hand over to the other Helen. Introduce yourself.
Hi, thanks, Helen. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Helen Stanley, and I manage the Social Work Academy, and I'm an experienced practice educator. So you've got the two Helens today.
Okay, so my role at Keele is to coordinate student placements and do practice educator training. I've been working as a practice educator for the last 16 years, so I've got a fair amount of experience at various things. So we'll crack on with our presentation. It is a live presentation, but we will take any questions at the end of the webinar rather than as we go along. So first off, just some practice observations that we had as kind of in terms of what was important really for the first few weeks of placement. And we're not going to go into these into any particular depth on this, because what we want to do is talk really about how you get to know your student. But these are just things that just, I suppose, just jot down and bear in mind as you're planning your placements on those initial couple of weeks with a student. So the first thing would be to use your student interview prior to the placement start date to clarify any expectations and plan for any reasonable adjustments required. So don't be afraid to ask those questions. If there's anything comes out on a placement application form, you know, ask those follow-up questions even before that placement starts to make sure that you're as prepared as possible for what that student needs on placement. Consider different strategies for learning preferences, so that you might have a visual learner, a kinesthetic learner. So think about how does that student learn best, and I think we might touch on that as we go through this presentation. Think about your use of the supervision contract. So Helen's going to talk a little bit about what is your supervision contract and what that looks like. To agree that kind of professional relationship. Think about setting clear expectations in terms of giving and receiving feedback. So what's important for that student to know? At what points are they going to get feedback? How are we going to give that feedback? What's the best format? And really manage some of those expectations right from the outset. Think about the importance of clear communications, particularly if you have a separate practice educator and on-site supervisor. Make sure it's clear who's doing which role, and make sure that those channels of communication between the practice educator, on-site supervisor and student are really clear and communicated to that student too about how that will happen. And finally, think about providing scaffolding and nurturing initially, and then consider your students' anxiety. So students will be anxious as they start placement, and think about how we build a plan of learning activities to really reflect their developing capabilities in practice. So thinking about, not throwing that student in at the deep end. How do we build on gradually increasing their confidence and gradually expanding the tasks that we're asking them to do. Okay, moving on to getting to know your student in practice. What we thought we would do is set this out, really looking at the Mandela model as a basis for kind of exploring how we might best get to know our students on placement. The Mandela model was drawn out of some research undertaken by Prosper Tadam. I think it was about 2010. I think she initially sort of began to develop the model, so it's been around quite a while now. Her research was initially with the experiences of Black African students on placement and some of the challenges they found, perhaps in the assessment environment, whereby practice educators may be predominantly white, female practice educators. And just some of those challenges that she kind of found. So the Mandela model was really a model that she developed to try and ensure that the practice educator was able to really understand the background of that student and to be able to work most constructively with them to ensure that they have the most appropriate assessment opportunity. So we're going to take each section in turn and go through those and why that's important. So I'm going to hand over to Helen to talk about making time.
Thanks, Helen. So it's really key in terms of getting to know your student that you plan your supervisions in so they're booked. I mean, I make sure that mine are booked throughout the placement in advance. And as Helen said, it's key to develop that clear communication between the on-site supervisor, the PE and the student if you're using that model. So there's real clarity about expectations. So I find the best way of doing that is to meet with the student and agree a supervision contract, which we've recently introduced into Worcestershire. So it's a standard contract which sets out how often you're meeting, and as Helen talked about, how the student wants to receive feedback. We also include the social graces model, which I'll talk about later. So following on from that contract, we also agree what the supervision template is as well, so there's no surprises for the student, and planning three-way supervisions at regular interviews to ensure good and effective communication. And also to plan in, particularly if the students work in a hybrid model or it's a virtual placement, that there's regular catch-ups. So I used to agree with my student, for example, we'd have a couple maybe first in the morning and then a couple just before the student logged off, just to give them that opportunity to ask any questions, and then regular catch-ups with the on-site supervisor as well. So I'm now going to pass over to Helen for acknowledged needs.
Okay, so acknowledging needs, the way I've looked at that really is thinking about reasonable adjustments, and in particular around disability, so student disability. Is there anything that the student specifically needs that would support them on placement? So it might be a student with dyslexia. Do they need any particular equipment or software putting in place, or are there any particular strategies that they use to ensure that they're able to meet the timescales that are needed, or to have any work proofread, or whatever their kind of strategy is? So it's worth always speaking to that student, particularly before the placement begins, if you can, to think about what is it that you need and how can we adjust that placement to make sure that we are able to support you. One of the things, it's really important to just bear in mind is that even though that there's students on placement, we still have to bear in mind the provisions of the Equality Act and how we support students with those reasonable adjustments as best we can. What I would also suggest you do with the student is where you have identified that there are reasonable adjustments needed. So I've used the dyslexia as an example, but there will be other adjustments for other different disabilities. So whether that be a physical disability, whether that be an underlying health condition that needs to be monitored and managed, and particularly in line with perhaps certain vulnerabilities in line with COVID as well, thinking about how do we kind of support that student there too. But agree a time to review how those are working. So think about not just put them in place and just leave them there, but talk to that student, 2 weeks into placement, 4 weeks into placement, as different tasks arise on placement. How are those adjustments that we've made working for you? Are they working, or do we need to think about readjusting to see how we best support that student on placement? So really thinking about what that student needs, acknowledge their needs. They will have different needs on placement. Disability is one, childcare might be another, carer arrangements might be another. Ultimately, for people who have caring responsibilities, Social Work England does say they need to be doing a full-time working week, so it should be 35 to 37 hours in the week. It's about thinking about, can we adjust perhaps timings in the day and readjust lunch breaks and things like that to support them as best we can, to think about how perhaps childcare, etc., is also looked at. But very much that conversation with that student, what do you need? How can we best support you based on where you're at now? Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Helen to talk a bit about difference.
Thanks. So as I mentioned earlier, we use the social graces model to illustrate this. So it's really important, obviously, to acknowledge your power as a practice educator or on-site supervisor. And then I do this as part of the supervision contract. So it's a collaborative process where you're acknowledging any difference between yourself and the student. So getting to know each other in a non-intrusive way. For example, looking at race, gender, religion. We're going to look at age, an example later. And celebrating those differences. And then that's role modeling as well for them working with children and adults. And that's just one way you can do it through the social graces model. I'm now going to hand over to Helen for education.
Okay, so I'm going to look at the next couple. So education is really, I think one of the things that's important to recognise is that students will come from a variety of different backgrounds and educational experiences when they come onto a social work programme. And it's often because they're in an educative situation with yourself on placement, they are there to learn, is understanding, I guess, what their prior experiences have been. I've asked the question there, has it been an easy or a difficult journey? If it's been a particularly easy journey, you've got a student who has sailed through school, sailed through university essays, for example, how might that student respond to perhaps their first part of negative feedback or feedback that feels like a massive criticism when you're giving them perhaps something they could improve on? So think about how that's been. It might be a student who's found education a real challenge and really struggles to believe in themselves when you're giving them positive feedback. So again, having that kind of thought about them. Think about what the expectations of others are in terms of their success. So have they got a significant family pressure around them in terms of expecting them to do well, to get a first in their degree or really excel at a master's? What's their own expectations of that? So really thinking about what pressures are there internally for themselves, externally from others, on that education experience, and how might your assessment of them and some of the feedback you're giving them impact on that expectation? And you may need to think about, how do I deliver some of that feedback to that student if it might come as a bit of a shock or a bit challenging to them? Finally, think about, have they got support outside of their family, or outside of the placement, outside, are the family supporting them with their education? It might be financial support, it may just be emotional support. It might be that you've got some very, very supportive families. They may have high expectations, they might just be there for that student. They might be helping with childcare whilst they're going through the education process. You may have other students who perhaps are struggling with their families because their families aren't allowing them the time to study, the time to do their placement, the time to reflect. There may be other commitments and challenges on that student. For example, being asked to babysit other family members or help out in a family business whilst they're trying to focus on a full-time placement and do the associated academic work alongside that. So there may be other kind of wider considerations that you just need to sort of explore with your student in terms of their education experiences and the expectations of others. And just linked to that, for those of you that have kind of looked at some of the work of Joe Finch around working with struggling students, you know, some of the things that Joe looks at is very much that education experience and how that can impact on, you know, how a student needs to be managed if they are beginning to struggle on placement. So it's worth having a look at her work there if you're, you know, you're thinking about education as kind of a key thing for your particular student and their experience of that. The next bit I'm going to look at, so it's going to be me again, is the student's life experience. Students will come to us on placement to social work course with a wide range of life experiences, and often those life experiences can be what's led them to social work in the first place. It might be a student who's been in care. It might be a student who has experienced mental health crisis. They may have positive or negative experiences of social workers, and that's why they've chosen to study social work. What's kind of key to think about is, are there any areas that might be a trigger for that student? So are there any areas that we maybe don't necessarily need to avoid, but perhaps have to support that student more greatly with? Some areas might be emotionally challenging for students. There are a whole host of, you know, different things that a student might find difficult on placement because it brings back some quite painful memories. So one of the initial questions you might look at is, you know, why did you choose to study social work? There is a little bit kind of theoretical background to some of this as well. If you want to have a look at the concept, Carl Jung talks about the wounded healer and how people's actual experiences of their life experiences and going into work in a similar kind of setting can actually really enhance their understanding and their empathy within that, if it's managed appropriately, if they're supervised with the right kind of support. On the flip side, I think it's Freud talks a little bit about, you know, perhaps could there be, you know, issues around identity. So have a think about, you know, there's just those kind of two challenges that you might want to kind of consider if you are looking at that student's life experience and how perhaps it relates particularly to that placement. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Helen to talk about age, the final part of the Mandela model.
Yeah, so it's really important in respect of all the social graces, but we thought age in terms of power. So what does this mean in terms of power within the relationship? So for example, if it's a younger student and an older PE, making sure that we don't get into Cartman's drama triangle where we become the rescuer or a paternal or maternal figure. And it's being aware about that and discussing that in supervision, or you could have an older student and a younger PE, or it could be same age. So it's just having those conversations. And for example, again, not making assumptions about people's age. So when we did the supervision contact recently with a student, we discussed ages and what implications that had for our collaborative working relationship. So I'm now going to hand over to Helen for some concluding remarks.
Okay, so just I suppose in summary, really, we've used the Mandela model kind of structure, kind of the different elements that you might want to look at when you're getting to know your student. And I think it is kind of something that just makes sure it catches everything and covers everything. And it really kind of highlights and brings out some of the challenges that, you know, the diversity and the differences between the student and the practice educator. Whilst, you know, as a practice educator, we might feel we want to work with people equally, that we treat people the same, that actually we need to really understand individuality to tailor the learning approaches to individual students. So think about, you know, getting to know that student, identifying their learning needs and how they best learn. Really think about that. Plan the work opportunities in stages, gradually increasing their complexity and involvement, and then regularly review with that student how it's working. I think that's really key. It's going back to that student to say, is this working? Isn't that working? How's this experience for you? Rather than assuming that you've got it right, or that it's worked for the last student, so it's obviously going to work for this student, because it may not. They're two very different people. So that would be our kind of sort of final sort of concluding remark. I've just done my final slide, just got some references there for you that touch on some of the different areas of practicing some of the different things that you might find helpful to pick up on. Okay, and that brings us to the end of our presentation, so I can stop screen sharing and hand over to the next presenters.
Thanks, Helen. We do have a couple of minutes if anyone has any questions, but thank you very much, guys, for that. Does anyone have any questions for Helen and Helen? No, that's fine. I will hand over then now to Zoe and Claire, who are going to come and talk to us about preparing the team for a student. And yes, so just to answer your question, Cheryl, the slides will be sent out to everybody following this. All of the slide packs will come out to you. Okay.
So just bear with me while I endeavour to share my screen.
It's there, Claire.
There we go. So just a bit of housekeeping. Obviously, if we have any tech issues, we will do our best to resolve them. So that will either be Zoe takes over or I take over. Not sure what happens if we both crash, but I'm sure we will figure it out. Just bear with me. So I'm Claire Skelson, social worker in practice learning at Staffordshire University, and I've been a practice educator for a very long time, and worked with many students through my career as a social worker in adult social work, and then also in my kind of coordination roles and organisations, and then obviously in the role that I do now, which is all things practice learning and arranging placements. Do you want to do an introduction? You always say that you don't want to follow me.
I always go after Claire and it's always a mistake. I'm Zoe Yeomans. I'm a social worker in adults by background, and my roles have been in adult learning disabilities and hospital teams. Been a practice educator for not as long as Claire, but very passionate about it, which led to me being a consultant social worker for the teaching partnership, and then coming over to Staffs Uni, where me and Claire work very closely together on everything practice learning, between placements, readiness for supervised practice, and those professional development days students come back to us for.
Excellent. And really good point. We're both very, very passionate about what we do, and anything that we share will be kind of based on our experiences or our research around the subject. So we're here today to talk about the practice learning placement and the importance of preparing the team. So I shall move us through the slides. I'm assuming everybody can see that because nobody's waving at me to say that they can't see that. I always like to use Borton with students, educators, newly qualified social workers. I just think it's a really straightforward but quite powerful model when you're thinking about what it is that you want to get across. Thanks, Helen, with regards to what it is that you're going to talk about and reflect on. So I've used it for this. So this is kind of, instead of us using learning objectives as part of the presentation, I've followed Borton. So what we want to cover today is the important things that the team must know, excuse me, in preparation for the student coming to the team or to the organisation. Anecdotally, whenever I've worked with struggling students, in whatever role I'm in, generally speaking, there will be some kind of element around if there's not been some kind of investment in preparing the team and preparing the organisation. So it's really, really important. But kind of the basics of what they need to know is timescales, really important. So when's the student coming? How long are they going to be with us? Are they part-time, full-time? Really, really important. What level? Absolutely crucial. So are they first placement or final placement? Really, really important. Because some of the people within your team, within the organisations, will have different experiences with different students, and you want to make sure that they're not seeing that student particularly at maybe at a higher level. So it's really, really important that they know, for example, a first placement student might be coming with very little experience, or you could have a first placement student that's coming with masses of life experience, but it's just about knowing what level they're at. Really, really important. What you don't want, for example, is students being compared to each other. So that's really important. Helen mentioned that. The Helen's mentioned that in the previous presentation, because that does happen. I will have comments such as, well, the student that we had last year was absolutely amazing, and this student should be able to pick up on where they left off. Absolutely not. It's about being clear at what level that student is and what's going to be expected. So that leads us nicely into what is the student assessed against. So those are kind of your main what's, what the team need to know. So what does that actually mean? So thinking about, so what learning opportunities is the student going to need to demonstrate their capability? So what's the role of the team in providing those opportunities? And see how I emphasize the team, because by no means are we in the territory where it's educator and students and nothing in between. Those days should have been gone a long time ago. It's about that whole wraparound approach that's already been mentioned around. There's a full webinar around the importance of that and that whole team approach. So really, really important. What's the status of the student? So I put that in there because it's a real reminder that they are a student. So I often hear teams make comments such as, oh, well, they're coming up on qualifying, that's great, they can pick up X, Y and Z pieces of work. That can be quite dangerous, because no, firstly, into their final year placement, they're not coming up on qualifying. So it's about how you increase gradually the work that they're involved in. So it's just that reminder that they are a student. They're not coming up on being a newly qualified social worker yet, for example. They're not a member of the team. They're not a member of the organisation. They are an addition. They're not there to pick up work that the team or the organisation has got outstanding. That's not to say sometimes that can work out as long as it's a learning opportunity, but it's not a case of, for example, with my adult colleagues, we've got 100 reviews that need doing. That's a great opportunity for the student. It is, but it needs to be done in a constructive way and be about learning opportunities and not just picking up the slack from the team. Another really important thing when we think about what are the boundaries? So we'll talk briefly today, but not in depth, but about when you have a struggling student, for example, and the difficulty if boundaries are stretched, because again, it's that reminder they are a student. So you get into all kinds of territory if a student's struggling, for example, and the drama triangle's already been mentioned, but I have had lots of experience where some members of the team will try and swoop in and rescue the students, which can cause real problems and cause divides within teams. So it's just thinking about boundaries. They are a student, they are a learner, they are not a member of the team. And then thinking about the now what, so what the next steps from this would be that when you're preparing the team, it's what they need to go and do next. So whether that be reading up on the professional capability framework, planning for some shadowing opportunities, but that's kind of the next level. Really great quote, and somebody's already mentioned, I think Williams and Rutter. So they talk very much about students need lots of varied opportunities. They need different skill mixes. It's no good them just being attached to one educator or one work-based supervisor. They need to see, for example, a multidisciplinary approach. But they talk a lot about, we also can't naively assume that all members of the team will feel positive towards a student. So I'm sure that you could all share experiences, and we're open to questions at the end about where there will be certain people within organisations that are not in the best place to be supporting the students, and that can be about workload pressure. It can be about when they've had a failing student themselves, because there's nothing worse. The research tells us that. I've had that experience. Working with a struggling student is really, really difficult, and if you have to fail a student, that's potentially going to put people off being involved in that student's experience. So we do need to take those things on board, but then it's about okay, how can we prepare those that are willing to be involved with the student? There might be somebody within the organisation that you just know is not going to be the best placed person, and we've got to be honest about that. We can't make everybody be accepting of working with students. And then also thinking about social workers' reluctance or other team members. We are still in a pandemic, so we need to be mindful of that fact. But then what Zoe and I have found, and we'll talk about it towards the end of the presentation, is we've really been able to revisit and reflect and celebrate what students bring to teams, even in a pandemic. So it's trying to put a positive spin on it as well. It's not all negative. Okay, thank you.
So the next part here is where, well, Claire and I use this quite a lot with our students and practice educators to talk them through the kind of the placement learning timeline of the key points. But for the purposes of this, what we wanted to point out was that the team can be involved at pretty much every single one of these stages, to, you know, different varying kind of levels, right from when you get the student placement profile. Obviously, as a practice educator, you will see that and you will kind of make that decision. Do I feel that I can support this student? But if you're saying, yes, I will take this student, with their permission, letting the team see that profile and know a little bit about that student beforehand can be a really useful tool in supporting them for who they're getting on the team, in line with what Claire was saying around knowing what level they're coming in, what their past life experience is. And it just gives the team a little bit of an insight into who's coming onto into their organisation, into their daily lives, because that's what we have to acknowledge, is the fact that the team are going to see these people and work with these students on a day-to-day basis as well as you. So they need to know who's coming in as well. Informal meeting is obviously a little bit harder. You can't have the whole team attending an informal meeting. But if it is held in person, you know, they may see this student arrive for their informal meeting. It's about them, you know, knowing that the student's coming, that is the day they're having the meeting, and that, you know, what time they might be there, so that they can, you know, be friendly, be approachable, and give a little wave and say hello. Obviously, if it's virtual, not so easy, but letting the team know how that informal meeting went. Oh, you know, I met with them, they were really open and chatty, and, you know, I think they're going to fit in really well, and I've said yes to the placement, keeping them along for the ride. Again, the formal learning agreement meeting, it's more about letting them know when it's happening and what's going on, and then planning for that start of the placement. So it's about speaking to the team in advance, and I know that I've done it before. A big part of that induction process starts before the induction happens. So it's about planning the opportunities for them, and finding shadowing opportunities, teams that they can meet, interesting things that they can be part of. But let the team bring that up as well. That could be part of a team meeting. You know, the student's due to start. Has anyone got anything that they think's worked well in the past? Has anyone got anything coming up? And some people might not necessarily have things planned. And it's about letting them know that if something does come up, they can just talk to the student and say, yes, you can come along to this. It doesn't need to be well, you need to check this with your practice educator first, and you need to make sure you're okay. The whole team can offer opportunities to students during that induction period and the whole placement, without having to, for want of a better term, kind of run it past mum or dad first. The practice educator is kind of the gatekeeper to the pass or fail, and to the experiences and the supervision, but the team itself can take an initiative if they think they've got something interesting that they can share. The same with the learning plan meeting. If the students identified what they want to get from the placement, which they should have, they should have by this point, then it's about, okay, who's best placed to support them. I know Claire will speak quite openly about when she had students coming on, she was direct payments kind of champion for her organisation. I had my little niche, and I'm sure everyone has areas of their practice that they're really confident with. So if there's someone in your team that can help a student meet a particular learning outcome, then link them up early on, let them know, and share that information. The induction itself, I think all of this feeds into, and obviously all of the presentations before ours, and I'm sure Amanda will talk about it after ours as well. We'll talk about how important the opportunities a student gets in induction are. A big thing we wanted to emphasise, which Diane and Deb mentioned at the beginning, is an induction needs to be more than just, here's a pile of paperwork, read it. Experiential learning is so beneficial for students. And if you think back to when you were a student social worker, no one really remembers reading the policies and procedures. They remember the experiences that they had. So it's about obviously being open and honest with the students about what your experiences are, what you feel confident sharing, and, you know, speaking to the practice educator, maybe yourself, and saying, I've got a great opportunity, do you think it works for the student, rather than constantly saying to the student, oh, I've got this great opportunity, but you need to check with the practice educator first. The team can do that in advance. The team can speak to the practice educator and say, shall I offer this? Because what you don't want to do is offer a load of really good opportunities and then the practice educator has to say, well, no, they can't do that. Have those discussions kind of separately to be able to offer the right things to the right students. One of the things I will mention here really briefly is multiple students. If your team's got more than one student, it's about being fair and equitable in offering those opportunities out, not just going to the same student, because looking back at the Mandela model that the Helen spoke about, that they're the same age as you, or they're somebody that you've related to, or the boundaries have stretched a little bit and you've got a better relationship with one student than the other because you find them more approachable, or more in line with what you would have expected. So it's about being mindful of that. A big thing that feeds into kind of the last three sections around supervision, midpoint and final report is your feedback, and we will talk about that, but it's about your feedback based on what the team have told you as well, not just what you've seen. You can't be all the eyes and all the ears in the entire placement period, so it's about knowing that your team are going to provide you with the feedback you need when it's needed, rather than you go to them at the end and say how you found the student and they say, oh, well, you know, they were useless, and you're thinking, well, why didn't you tell me this, 70 days ago, so we could have addressed it. So yeah, it's just about making sure that through every single part of the placement learning timeline, the whole team are involved wherever they can be.
And what's brilliant through that whole talk then, Zoe, it's the whole team. So you're referring to the whole team. At no point was it the practice educator students, or if you or I were working with the students. Now, we've both been guilty of it. I've used language such as my students.
And my student come out with you.
Yeah, because it's language, as we all know, language is very, very powerful. So even just little things like that when you're preparing the team, don't ever refer to the students as your students. I mean, main thing, because it needs to be that whole team approach, but also it can be, it's a little bit oppressive, isn't it? Because we don't own that student. So there's lots of good reasons to refer to the student as the student, the student that's with our team. If somebody comes up to you whilst you're supporting and assessing a student and opens the conversation with, your student's done such a thing, you've got to have that confidence to kind of reframe that for them, that no, it's the team's student. So really, really important. So, and I think a few things are popping up in the chat, but I think if we come to those maybe at the end. So I think it's comments as opposed to questions, which is great. So let's talk about assessment. Really, really important. The team's got to know what the student's been assessed against and how they may demonstrate capability. And there's lots of reasons for that, because obviously we all want successful placements, but also because if they don't, then what are their expectations of that student? And that's back to understanding the level that they're at, what they're being assessed against, what can be expected of them. I'm often asked, can a student do a particular type of assessment? For example, in adults, can a student do a Mental Capacity Act assessment? Nothing anywhere says that a student can't be part of a Mental Capacity Act assessment. For example, they could be contributing towards that assessment as part of that building relationships with individuals. But we've got to move it away from thinking about the task that they can or cannot do. It's got to be about their capability and what's expected of them at the level that they're at. So really, really important, which takes us nicely into the professional capability framework, which Zoe's smiling because she knows I like to talk about this. My learning over years of working with students and working with some struggling students is the importance of the team having some kind of understanding. And that can be a team that's not all social workers. So for example, in a hospital team, it's often, if any of colleagues are here from a health setting, you'll be asked, well, what is it that what do social workers do? So this can be framed in such a way that if you're sharing it with a team or an organisation, you just do something brief around what the professional capability framework is, why it's there. That can be really, really beneficial as a whole. So certainly for the student's experience, but also for the people within the team. So certainly any social worker should be willing to listen to you talk about the professional capability framework, because that's part of their CPD. It's a requirement of their registration. But if you'll have all kinds of learners in organisations, potentially apprentices, newly qualified social workers. So it's always going to be relevant. If it's an organisation where there are no social workers, it's still really important that you can talk them through, this is what the students are assessed against with regards to their values and ethics, how they challenge inequality, for example. It's about how they practice, so how they use their skills around assessment, building relationships with people, and how they bring about change. So that's taken me about 30 seconds to say that, but just giving people kind of the brief of what it is the students being assessed against is honestly really, really important. Again, when I've had experiences working with struggling students, the kind of the feedback afterwards was, well, we didn't know what was expected of them, particularly if it's not a team of social workers. You would hope a social work team would have the understanding, but if you're in an organisation where there's very few social workers, then you can't just expect that. Something that's really worth doing is a team activity. So for example, tell them the level that the student is at, and then how might they demonstrate their capability whilst on this placement. Really great activity. Obviously, we've got the beauty of Teams now, so it can be something that doesn't have to be massively time consuming. Get them to follow the Basra link, look what it says around capability and the level that the student's at. But you want ideas from them, because they will come, like all students we work with, you learn, we learn, I learn from every student I've ever worked with. You'll learn things from people in your team. So a team member may think of opportunities that you've never even thought of. So again, it's that whole team approach. So that's something I'd certainly advocate for as an activity with your team. I won't go through all of these slides, but I won't go through both of these slides in depth, but when we think about what opportunities students need to have, if you just showed this to the team, so the team the student's going to, or even the organisation they're going to, pretty much any placement, particularly level 6 statutory, is going to give these types of opportunities. But this is what Social Work England says they would expect a student to experience whilst on placement. So like I say, I'm not going to read through it all. Obviously, the first one's around what is expected around working in a non-discriminatory manner. So wherever they are, that's going to be expected. Common learning opportunities, thinking about formal assessments, presenting outcomes, so thinking about resource allocation systems, for example, in adult services, potentially presenting at courts, multidisciplinary meetings. There's going to be lots. So this I've found is quite reassuring to teams when you say, think about, I mean, I would even reframe it, think about what you do in your day-to-day role, what opportunities might a student have that's going to help them to demonstrate their capability. So there's just plenty there, and I think teams do benefit from that. Team feedback.
Muted. Had to be one, it had to be me. I think the important thing about, just very quickly, the slides that Claire's mentioned before links in with a comment that was made in the chat as well, that if you let the team know what a student's expected to do and what a student is confident and capable to do based on kind of the level they're coming at in, I think that can reduce the ability for the team to just go to them with any old opportunity and make it a little bit more directed. So I just wanted to add that in just while I thought about it.
No, absolutely. And I think we talked about this, didn't we, Zoe, that there's no black and white to social work, certainly, and there's no black and white to practice learning, is there? So yes, we might say it's a whole team approach and we want the student to have lots of opportunities, but absolutely totally agree with what Helen's saying. You've got to be careful, because the student could become overwhelmed, or they'll end up picking up all the reviews, for example. So yeah, really good point.
And students are going to want, it links in with the power, students are going to want to do whatever they're asked to do to show that they're willing and they're team players and they're eager to be there. So the team need to have a little bit of knowledge around that as well. Yeah. So yeah, just while I was thinking about it, I thought I'd add that in. So we touched on it briefly back at the beginning of our kind of presentation, but team feedback. So whilst your role is really important as a practice educator, this is what we say to our work-based supervisors when we do their training. Your role is really important to give feedback to the practice educator so that they can feed back to the student's portfolio. So we left the kind of your role as in the team's role is very important. So feedback from you as a practice educator, a work-based supervisor and a team is going to kind of impact on that overall pass-fail portfolio recommendation for the next placement or newly qualified year. So we would say that as a team, they can be providing feedback on all of these areas from day one, rather than waiting. We always say to students, don't wait until your midpoint or your next supervision with your practice educator or your next supervision with your work-based supervisor to tell them that you've been struggling or to tell them that something's happened at home. So the same needs to be said to the team. Don't wait until I ask you for feedback. Give me some feedback as you have it. If you've got something you want to say about our student, about the team's student, then just say it. Send me an email, or are you going to set something formal up where you have a little drop in and the student knows that everyone's going to talk to them? It's not going to work that way. It's got to be a way that works for you as a team. So are you going to regularly check in with the team and say, has anyone got anything they want to tell me about the student? Kind of makes it a little bit authoritarian rather than having those set outlines at the beginning of, so I need feedback from the team for the portfolio. I'd really like you to bring that to me as you've got it, as you think of it, as they do something, as they show something really good or not so good, so that we can address it as it comes up, because it's really important, like I said before, that we identify these things as early on as possible. If they are constantly late, or if they're a bit rude, or they seem to have a strange kind of approach to their work that you don't really understand, that needs to be flagged with the practice educator so that they can have that discussion. And it may be that they didn't realise it was coming across as rude, or they've really struggled with the whole idea of being in work, or their mind's been somewhere else. But if we leave it until it's too late, that's when we get struggling students and potentially failing students that we need to work on. So I think Claire was going to come in here with...
Yeah, absolutely. Complete golden rule. I suspect many of us have had this experience. I've had it many times where a student is struggling. You go and ask for feedback, say, for example, 30 or 40 days in, and then suddenly everybody's coming to you and saying things like, the student's always late, the student's never off their phone, they were rude to a service user. Why have you waited? And I understand, because it can be difficult, can't it? If you're not trained around practice education, thinking about how you're going to kind of challenge the student on their actions. But it's absolutely dreadful if it's just left. Like we always say in any training to supervisors and practice educators, for example, don't wait till the midpoint if you've got some concerns. You'll notice I'm not saying failing student, I'm saying struggling student, because there's kind of a shift away from failing, which is absolutely right, because what we hope is we can support that student to improve and demonstrate capability. But there is nothing worse than getting all that feedback either at the end of the placement or not until you start raising concerns within the team. And there's a lot of human nature in that students, particularly final year, will be with a team for 100 days. They build relationships with people. But then that's about, at the beginning when I said about the status of the student, you've got to continue to reinforce they are a learner, they are a student, they're not your friend, they're with the team, but they're not a member of the team. And these are difficult conversations to have, but we have to have them. And I think teams do struggle with that, particularly the Christmas time, the big ELB, get them out on the Christmas meal. You have to think about boundaries because they are constantly being assessed. But yeah, golden rule, really reinforce to your team. Please don't wait to feed something back. Also, positively frame it that you want lots of good feedback. But what you don't want is, Claire, the student's wonderful and she's so polite and she's really fitted in. Yes, we want to hear that, but we also need some constructive feedback as well. I think this is something all because we're caring people, we all struggle with it. But yeah, golden rule, you tell the team, don't wait. That takes us nicely into what students bring to the team.
I think the formatting is still on this one, where it pops up all beautifully because I get a little bit carried away with PowerPoint. So when we worked with work-based supervisors, we spoke about what a student can bring to the team, and there's so many different things, and I don't know whether anyone wants to write in the chat what they feel a student brings to the team, if they've had students before, or what they're hoping a student will bring to their team if they've got a new student coming to them, or if anyone wants to wave and say hello to us.
Shall I pop some in the chat as well? Because it's not showing us, it's Zoe, because we did
You
it quite
should
fancy.
you should be able to click next, and they might pop up. Knowledge of current issues, policy and legislation. Thanks, Deb. I know everyone else is probably like, oh, I just came to listen. I didn't want to be involved. Training.
Yeah, it's not letting me.
Is it not? That's fine. We'll change it for the version. I think on the version that Deb's got, you'll be able to click through it. But we've got things like project work. They can do pieces of work. Some of the work that, as social workers, we wish we could do. Some of those like really intense pieces of work that would really support somebody, they can get involved with that, and they can use that. Question and curiosity. Thank you, Teresa. See you tomorrow. The up-to-date legislation, I can see that. I've now lost my chat box, which is helpful. There it is. Asking the why question. I love the why question. We speak to our students and say, turn into your children or whatever child you know and just constantly ask why. A really positive outlook and perception of the profession. It can, yeah. And I think sometimes it's a little bit rose tinted, and it's not about the placement to kind of poo-poo all their ideas of what they think a social worker looks like, but it can remind us all of why we're in the profession and why we're doing what we want to do. Steph, I love that. They can update your library of resources. Absolutely, it's brilliant, and it's a way to meet one of their PCF domains as well. You know, it's that sharing of knowledge. New or unfamiliar research. I know we've had a lot of organisations that have said they made me think about different reflective models, and I've not thought about reflection in years. And it was really helpful with the Social Work England re-registration period that they made me think about looking at reflection in a different way. Some of the other things we've got are developing a database about local resources, which links into that, updating your library, scoping for new services, promoting your organisation. They're going to be positively kind of making links with people to get to know things, and they will promote what you're doing. A great thing that we love hearing that practice educators have done is we get them to work on the induction pack for the next student that you're due to have. You know, what experiences did they have while they were on placement with you? So that takes a bit of the pressure away from the team too, because they're doing a little bit of that work. And sharing the knowledge of the PCF and what they're going to be responsible for in the future. Motivation to learn, wonderful things coming in. By asking the why question, they can lead us to reflect, and this can change, organisational change. Love it, Laura. Enlightening your own experiences and relighting your own passion, Wendy. That's brilliant. And while we're talking about that being what happens for us, it can work for the team as well. So it's just really important to be able to see what a student brings to the team. And there is, as I've been mentioned a couple of times, a whole webinar on the team around the student approach that the teaching partnership in mine and Laura's iteration last year put together. So it's well worth a watch, or giving it to your team to watch and in light of your next student. So thank you very much. And that's the end of me and Claire.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Zoe and Claire. That was really interesting. Thank you. And I'm sure that the conversation can continue in the chat as well. But we do need to move on to our next presenter now. But thank you both so much. So our next one is Amanda Fitchett from Coventry University, who's presenting on the capturing the learning and the evidence from the induction period.
Hello, my name's Amanda Fitchett. I'm an assistant professor at Coventry University, where I run the PG Cert Practice Education course. I've been involved in practice education, both as a practice educator and as someone who's taught on practice education courses for almost 25 years. And sometimes I found myself being challenged by both practice educators and students about the purpose of induction and whether it's fair to assess students during this time. An example of comments I've had in the past are, there's a view that induction's just a time for students to settle in, that assessing the student at the point of induction is unfair because they haven't had time to learn from the placement experience, and that assessing the student will make them anxious at that point. But there are counter arguments to this, which I strongly believe to be the case, that we should make use of the richness of the evidence available from the induction process. And I think that key issues here are that we should start the placement off in the firm understanding that a core purpose of the placement is the assessment of the student. We also need to be clear about where evidence can be drawn from, because that adds purpose to the induction learning curriculum. Also, that assessment at the induction stage can inform learning objectives for the ongoing placement. And it would be unfair on the student to be unclear about what or when assessment is taking place. And it does take place right from the very beginning of the placement. I'm just going to briefly, I'm not going to read all these PEPS domains, but I've pulled out what I think are the key domain descriptors in the PEPS document, which guides practice educators as to what is involved in the practice educator role. So I've pulled out a couple of from domain A, just the ones that I felt were more easily linked to induction processes. Then I pulled out some from domain B, but of course domain C is the main PEPS domain that talks about assessment processes. But if we look here, we can see that part of the role of the practice educator is to devise an induction plan that takes into consideration their previous learning, their previous experiences. And in doing so, we can then draw on that as the induction process moves forward. Another issue, I think, here is that we need to be working openly with everybody involved in the learning process, and particularly the student. In domain B's, this is more focused on planning, with the learning with the student. And sometimes practice educators haven't always had an opportunity, perhaps, or an awful lot of time to discuss with the student before they come on placement what their learning needs might be. But the induction process helps us define that more clearly. And I also think that domain B5 here is quite important, that we need to make sound and reasoned judgments about the level of work the student can be allocated. Although this is more holistically across the whole placement, it's all equally important in induction. But if we return to domain C, which is very much focused on managing the fair and transparent assessment of students in placement. Again, I've not listed all the components of that domain, just the ones that I thought were relevant more to induction processes. So one of the things we want to be able to do through the induction process is encourage students to self-evaluate, to seek feedback from others in order to develop their performance. And this then can link into them developing learning outcomes of their own for the remainder of the placement. I also think that practice educators do need to provide timely, honest and constructive feedback, and they need to do that right from the start. because sometimes it's in the induction process that we begin to see students who might not perhaps quite understand the role of the placement or the role of the agency, and we need to be able to be honest and put them right, so that they're right from the start. They have an opportunity to rethink and relearn, so that they can progress through the rest of the placement. And finally, I think that, engaging students in the design and planning of their induction process will certainly help in terms of them being able to identify their own learning needs as that process develops. Because induction, although we might have perhaps 2 or 3 weeks at the beginning of a placement, induction doesn't end at that point. There still might be things that students wish to learn, perhaps a particular experience that we need to identify, particular casework to meet, but also they might want to learn about other parts of the organisation, and visits can always be arranged later. We don't just have to stick to the induction at the beginning of a placement. The other thing I wanted to just make sure I mention is the PEPS values statements. And again, I've only picked out a couple of these that I thought were more relevant to the induction process. The first one is about accepting and respecting the students' own circumstances and how they might impact on learning, and also to be able to build on a student's strengths and consider their own learning styles, and to arrange assessments, including in the way that students might prefer. Although obviously later on in the placement we might want to stretch their learning styles to include more reflection or more theory, for example. But also the final PEPS value that I've picked out is assessing, and this goes across everything that we do with students, of course, is to assess in a manner that doesn't stigmatise or disadvantage students. And I think that we need to do this throughout the whole placement, obviously, but we particularly need to give it extra attention, I think, right at the beginning of the placement when we perhaps don't know our student very well. And using models like Mandela or things like that can help us get to know our student more. And therefore, the more we know about them, the less likely we are to disadvantage them. So I think that when we teach our practice educator course, we review their induction and their early supervision notes and lots of other things after that, but in particularly in the induction process. And we find that practice educator trainees are really good at organising induction activities that might include visits to other teams, other parts of the organisation, shadowing, training courses, student support and check-ins, making sure the student gets to know the team, and all of those kind of things usually are present in any induction plan. But what often is missing, or that students are less articulate about, is how those events are going to provide a really rich opportunity for assessment against the assessment criteria. Assessment criteria being the PCF, the KSS, or Social Work England's professional standards. So one of the things that I think that we need to do is, thinking about, well, how does assessing in the induction help a student? And I've listed a few things here. There, it's by no means a full list at all. And obviously, the things that we do in the induction mustn't forget that we've still got the full 70 days or 100 days in the placement in which we can assess fully the student. But I think you can make a really significant start and set the placement off on its right foot if we begin to think about what we can do, how it helps and how we can go about it. So I think that assessing the student in induction helps set the tone of the placement as a learning and assessment experience. I think it enables the student to see that there's much to be gained by fully engaging in the induction process rather than seeing it as a tick box that, oh, once I've done all these things, then I can get on with the casework. I think it offers a view of progress that can be reassuring to students, particularly if they can see that they're already in that induction process meeting some of the assessment elements, perhaps the PCF or the apprenticeship standards, whatever it might be. I think it also offers an opportunity for the practice educator to assess what future learning is required for the placement. And that can be really useful in terms of planning the rest of the curriculum. So what could we assess? This is, again, just a few examples, and there are many more, and I would encourage you to think about what else could you add to this list when you think about practice education in your particular establishment, your particular team, because it's always going to be different. So I think you can assess things like basics such as timekeeping and diary management, which we know can be a major issue when it comes to students who begin to struggle on placement. So it's a really good opportunity to be able to assess this. Also, I think that you can assess students' confidence in approaching others, so approaching teams and colleagues for meetings, for shadowing and all of those sorts of things. And a student recently, a practice educator trainee actually, talked to me recently about the student being very uncomfortable in making telephone calls. And this quite commonly comes up as an issue of difficulty. So being able to assess a student's confidence in these things is very helpful. It's very useful if you know that students are anxious about making telephone calls before you start allocating them work where they're going to have to do lots of that. In terms of, I think that there's knowledge to be gained from training, and I think that you could, for example, get the student to think of 5 key learning points of learning from a training experience. Quite often, what we see in supervision notes is students saying, it's practice educators saying things like, the student attended a training course about X, Y, or Z. And that's it. That's all you see. But actually what we want to know is, what did they learn? So you can perhaps get them to pull out 5 key points. You could ask them why this knowledge is important in practice that they've gained, how the knowledge informs anti-oppressive practice, values and ethical practice. There are lots of ways in which you can ask the student to focus on particular points of learning from those training events that they attend. The other thing that I think needs more definition sometimes with trainee practice educators particularly is getting the students to reflect on their shadowing experiences using a model of reflection of some kind. Thinking about what the student has observed, why social work might be involved in that particular situation, what theories are informing the student's understanding, what models and methods did they observe, how are issues of equality, diversity and inclusion impacting on that particular situation, what exploration of values could be had in exploring the key issues of that particular piece of work, what skills has the student observed, and whether the student can hypothesize about what might need to happen next after the visit that they've shadowed. So there's a real richness in gathering evidence here. And I think that in early practice educator trainee induction plans and in supervision notes, we don't necessarily see evidence of those key questions. You'll see that I've highlighted the what, why, how questions in that bottom quote there. And I think those questions are vital. We need to be interrogating the evidence and the experience of the student so that we can begin to build up a picture of where the student's knowledge, values and skills lie. The list on the previous slide is probably endless, but what is important is that in using an approach that almost everything is accessible, enables the practice educator and the student to gain significant progress with the assessment against the assessment criteria, such as the PCF. Inevitably, as part of the induction process, though, an understanding of gaps in the student's knowledge, values and skills will become apparent. And in identifying these gaps early on in the placement, the practice educator and the student are enabled to have a clearer view about what might need to be key learning needs or objectives as the placement moves forward. So what do we want as an outcome of the induction? And again, I think this is important and sometimes not something that practice educator trainees focus on. Because I think that the key aim of induction is to enable the student to understand the key function of both the agency and the team in which they're placed. Some university curricula ask for a piece of work that articulates this, but if they don't, then it might be something you want to get the student to write a short piece about. So can they articulate these key things? What is the agency's function? What's the team's role within that function? What are the overarching approaches of the agency and the team? What key knowledge, values and skills will they need to have? What models and methods can assist in the work of the team and the placement? And do students have a sound value base that respects the people and carers that we work for? I think it's much better to assess students than it is to make assumptions. So when you look at the list that I've just read out, they're the key things that I would be looking for in a social work student before I want to be allocating work to them, particularly work that they might be doing on their own without me watching. So unless we incorporate assessment into induction, how will we know that the student understands those key issues on the previous slide? We can't assume that they have the knowledge, values and skills. We have to assess that they do. In this way, as practice educators, we become more confident that students are able to transfer the knowledge, values and skills they've gained into the casework that we then want to allocate to them. And I think that we need to check out those things because we have a duty to the people who need our services to be certain that a student with appropriate support, obviously, have this key understanding before we allocate them to move forward with casework. So I hope that that's helped you think about how you might gather assessment information through the induction process. Personally, I think it's absolutely vital that we do assess students and that we make clear to students that we're assessing them right from the start, and that we use that very valuable material to demonstrate to them that actually, even in the first couple of weeks of placement, they are beginning to meet the assessment criteria. So just on this final slide, I've just put a couple of references that you might want to look at in terms of further reading. I haven't really focused on models of assessment because that wasn't really the remit of this discussion. But we do think that Claire Stone's model offers the transparency that I've talked about in some of these slides. So that's a good article to read, as is chapter 6 from Phil, Jasper and Littler, the Practice Education in Social Work book that we use as a key teaching tool with our practice educator trainees. So I hope that's been useful. I am here in the webinar, so I can take questions. I just thought it would be easier to record my presentation, as my voice and my breathing can be a bit unreliable at times. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amanda. I know there's lots of there's been some comments in the chat about how helpful that's been as well. I'm aware that it is 3:30, but Amanda is here if anyone wants to ask any questions to her, if anyone's got any further comments that they want to put in the chat for her to respond to. But if you do need to leave now, then thank you so much for coming, and hopefully we'll be able to share this webinar on the website as well, to sort of support with sort of further learning and development. But can I just say a big thank you to all of our speakers today, for combining all of your expertise and experience to support our learning and development as well. So thank you on behalf of the partnership. See, thanks everyone. Yeah, thanks, Amanda. I don't think we've got any hands, but I think we were running right up to time then as well.
Okay, no problems, no problems at all.
But no, thank you very much. I think everyone's very good positive feedback about the webinar and in your presentation as well. So thank you. Thanks, Leslie.
I'm going to return